This show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hi guys, welcome across to Teach Talk Radio. You are joined by me and John. We're just going to introduce you to our lovely show, and a late change is fabulous Khan Duke, who's decided to join us to talk about all things in the future of assessment and time for change. We're still hoping that Mike Kentz is going to join us. We're not sure at the moment, but with American time and things like that, we're not sure where we're going. And just to introduce, it's a good chance to introduce our partners and our sponsors, which is the fabulous John Catt, which is brought to us by John Catt Educational Publishers. Really fantastic professional books and resources, really good, great teaching and learning tools in terms of schools, and you can really develop your professional understanding from that. You can use a code to get 20% off, which you can see there. And then we have the fantastic, I know we've been playing around with this recently, isn't it? The Kialo Education Services. So it's a BET award winning, and it's definitely something that we've had a try of. We love ourselves. 100% free talk for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion is definitely
I absolutely love it. I've been using that one in the classroom for generating some really good debates. It can't recommend it highly enough.
Yeah, and just getting them to really deepen their subject knowledge and that critical thinking, which is a great skill to have. So, Khan Duke, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit and about your background for us, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Khan Duke. I am broadcasting out of Germany. I teach at a local teaching college, a university, where we train young people to become teachers of English in German secondary schools. Yep, that's what I do. And lots of assessment, different types of assessment. So this is going to be, I think, a great conversation.
So what is your age range then? Because me and John are traditionally 7 to 18.
Okay, so I take them after they've left school. So that would be 19 to 25, 26.
Oh, that's exciting, because we've kind of got the full age range covered.
Okay.
Sort of like looking at it.
Yeah. And then obviously, personal experience with children my own kids who've been in primary school and currently in primary school and in secondary school.
Yeah, we've got kids ourselves in primary school. So yeah, hopefully we can go through where we think their assessments are and then further on. So we'll start off with the first one. What do you like in terms of, if we go through this traditional assessment methods that we have right now, and the progress that students are making, where do you feel are some of the challenges and the problems that we might have for them thinking about that time for a change?
Well, I think for me personally, right, in my experience, I think the biggest jump is when they come out of secondary school into university, right, where they've got one kind of assessment where, and also one style of assessment that's very much teaching to the test, or even their way of preparing for assessment is very just in time preparation. I see with very many young people who've come out of school and then they struggle at university because it's not assessment in the traditional way that they know it. That's a good question. What is traditional assessment?
Yeah, I suppose, what is it like? What does it look like now? I mean, I don't know about you. It's 20 years since I was at university. A little bit longer for you, John.
Thanks for that.
So what do you think? Like, what does it look like now? Has it changed much?
Well, I mean, I have taught in the UK. I taught at a British university on both a degree program, English language program, and I've taught in the International Foundation program at a British university, and now I'm teaching here at a German university. And I think assessment now, it's not just testing. I mean, when people, if you speak to any layperson, the first thing, if you say to them, oh, I'm interested in assessment, or I'm doing this research program, research project on assessment, the first thing they think is, oh, you're doing something relating to testing. But, and I think that's where we need to clarify that assessment is not only testing. So at university, both in my experience in the UK and in Germany, we've not just got tests and exams for assessment, but we've also got, there's a big push towards problem-based learning, project-based learning, not just assessing content knowledge, but also assessing skills.
Yeah, and if you look at the traditional assessment that we have right now with GCSEs and A levels, how well do we both think that it fits in relation to problem solving and all the things you've discussed?
Yeah,
and I've got to say, I don't think it's hitting the pot spots that we want it to.
We have in the UK, we have something called the EPQ, the Extended Project Qualification, which kind of apes some of that methodology that is used at university. So there's a presentational element; it follows the learning pathway, and I really rate it. I think it's a fantastic thing to do, but it's an add-on, it's an extra, it's a peripheral. And despite the fact that I think it captures some of the most important skills, and as you say, most of what seems to happen at 16 and 18, particularly in the UK, and I think probably in other systems as well, it's to an exam, narrow silos of knowledge, very much rote learning, often very, as you say, last minute.
Yeah, I think my experience as well, having gone to school in Singapore, and you know, a lot of my friends are teachers in Singapore, similar to the UK, similar to Germany, Singapore, these high stakes exams that you know, either your exams at age 16, so your secondary, or your post-secondary, your sixth form, college and higher, right? They're all really preparing you for these high stakes exams. There are other exam boards, like you say, the extended project and other exam boards at international schools where they don't have these GCSE equivalents, where it's, you know, a lot of projects. But not everybody has the luxury or the finance to go, you know, to an international school or have alternative provision.
Yeah,
right?
The IB system is very different, much more project based, much more continuous assessment, but also very academically rigorous. But as you say, how many people can access that? It's a very limited catchment that you're picking up. And there are other assessment systems across the world, but again, as you said, these are peripheral, some Montessori schools, and significant, isn't it, that there are many of the sort of the, if we think about the big tech bosses, you know, Jeff Bezos went to a Montessori school. He sends his kids to a Montessori school. They don't focus on exams. And there are some pretty big some very well rated education systems around the world that have a different approach. So the Finnish system, very different.
Yeah. I think also what we have to consider, in line with the theme of our conversation today, with the future of assessment, is that with a greater awareness of neurodiversity, right? Different kids, different people learn differently and acquire knowledge differently. I mean, we have to do something with that knowledge. What's the point of saying, oh yes, we acknowledge that there's neurodiversity, that different kids. I mean, we've had that in language teaching for so long. I remember 20 years ago when I first started, this whole, what kind of language learner are you? Kinesthetic. It's the only one I remember. Sorry, I can't rattle them off. But visual, there's
visual, auditory.
There's visual, there's auditory, and all that.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, if we're aware of that in language teaching, and we're using the information from that knowledge in language teaching to design our classes, why are we not using that in mainstream education, right? So we know, people are neurodiverse. I learn well by, reading, and I'm good at a paper pen test just because I am. But, there are people who perform better in an oral exam,
Mhm.
right?
That was me. Totally.
Yeah. See, and I think I do understand the challenge. The challenges, you can't have a whole cohort of young people at 18 and say, okay, for this group of students, we're going to have this exam, and for that group. But we have to kind of recognize, is there a different way then of assessing what they've learned over these 2 years?
Is that
Why?
if you're going to say, you're at that front end, you get these students and we have trained them in a certain way. And for me, they are very much trained for the exam. That's what they're prepared for. And that's definitely what, I don't know about you, John, I feel like that's increased in the 12 years I've been teaching. What would you want us to do differently then to help prepare them for university, or the work would be the other one?
Well, I think there's a lot of paper-based exams with summative and formative. Yeah, there's summative assessment and there's formative assessment. Very much, I think, if I go out on a limb, I'd say it's 90% of what's done as assessment is tests and exams.
Yeah.
Students work within a time limit. Students are told, that's the other thing. Students are told, I don't know how it is in the UK, but I know that in Germany, students get, first of all, they're not, how can I say that? They get told when they've got an exam. Okay. But usually that would be like, like my kids would come back and they'd say, oh yeah, I've got my, German test or my Latin test in 2 weeks. And they'll come with an A4 sheet of paper. This is what you need to know for your Latin exam. So they're literally learning for the test, studying to the test, right? And there's no incentive. I found it very difficult. And also with my own students at university, there's no incentive for them to do regular revision, retrieval practice. I try that with my students, but they're like, and then they get so disappointed when they get their final exam and certain things that they've revised for didn't come up. I mean, there's only so much one could ask in 90 minutes. What I would really like is for a lot fewer paper-based testing that directs students to just, prepare for the test, but more holistic knowledge, getting students to think about, well, if I'm learning this, what are the learning objectives? What does my teacher want me to know? So that's it. See, if it boils down to anything, it's to align your assessment to the learning objectives. And it can't be, the learning objectives cannot simply be content knowledge.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that the students, increasingly as we see this kind of move to just teach to the test, is we're seeing students become increasingly concerned that there's a disconnect between what they're learning and the real world, because they recognize that what we do doesn't really replicate, as you said, it's not what happens at university, it's not what happens in the world, and they're increasingly becoming disconnected from this exam process, seeing it. And I think I had a conversation with a year 11 student I was teaching last year, and he said, "Sir, I'm just here to get the papers and move on." And
that's a similar experience I had. I have this course that I teach to first semester students. It's a compulsory pedagogical grammar course. So it's about the grammar of the English language. And because as future teachers, you need to know the grammar. And we've got the passing threshold. And what so many students do is, well, it's a difficult course, obviously. And my policy has always been, you'll get your grade and your exam paper back after you've come to see me. And I've had so many students who've come in to see me. I speak to them one-on-one, and the good ones, I go, yes, well done. And the ones who've just about got over the passing threshold, I can see it in their eyes. They don't really care what I have to say. And I actually had one student who said, oh, it doesn't matter. I'm just glad I passed. Yeah. And I say to them, but if you're going to go into a classroom, you need to know more than this. This does not demonstrate a confident level of knowledge of, English grammar. And they're like, yeah. I thought that was a bit rude.
About trying to get that sheet of paper at the end that I passed, and it was really interesting. Going back to your EPQ you were talking about, John, and we both value it. I think it's a really, really good course. It has its challenges since AI has come in, essentially. But I always remember this year asking some students of mine, what did they think of it? And it was really interesting. Unless it helped them to get directly into university, they didn't value it. They didn't understand the skills they were picking up. They didn't understand the whole rationale of being able to write a report and source and all the things they were learning. It was just, and is that the problem that we've created, that all we're doing is saying, get this is important, get past it. And, you know, we do try and put our skills into the lesson, but I think the messaging maybe is missing.
And it is difficult to message that when schools in particular, and this is, I mean, my experience, and I'm sure Mike will echo this, of being in the UK, and I can imagine there's probably something similar in Germany, and I know that there is in the UAE, is that when your school is graded on its results, you focus your teaching and students on those end goals and just getting through that exam, because that's what you are being assessed on. So our assessment is shaped by our assessment. Our approach to what students are being assessed on is shaped by how we as schools are being assessed.
And I think we're only going to get that change when they change the measurement, when they start to maybe focus on skills more, and putting that priority on that than the end result of a.
I think it's two things, because yes, in Singapore it's similar where schools are assessed. I mean, you know, and in various other places, there's a ranking of schools, and when we have in Singapore they do, well, when I was growing up we used to do British GCEs. They were called the Singapore Cambridge, you know, GCE exams, and you'd have, I mean, Singapore is so small, so you could put in the newspaper, you'd have it in the national newspaper. This particular schools had X number of A's and right, whatever, amazing combinations and things like that. So, like you say, the schools were assessed, the schools were ranked. So, and the only way that these schools could be ranked was by those raw numbers, right? So yes, that needs to change. But the other thing, for example, in Germany, we don't have a school ranking. Okay, and yet assessment is the way it is. So the question I have for you guys is, do you think the problem is even earlier than that in our own teacher training, we're not taught about assessment?
I'll be honest with you. I'm thinking back to my teacher training, which, as Mike very kindly pointed out, was a long time ago, 27 years. I don't.
So maybe that's where the field of assessment should change.
And we really weren't. We really didn't talk about assessment. We didn't look at it. It was almost a byproduct. I think the first time I really encountered assessment was sitting doing some coursework moderation in one of my training schools, and I'll be honest, I don't think assessment really has shifted very much in those 27 years. But we need to talk about. So one of the questions we need to look at is, what is the purpose of assessment? Why are we assessing? What's it for?
Takes 45 minutes out of class time on the day of assessment.
Gives the teacher somewhere to sit down for a minute.
But that takes about a week out of your life when you're marking.
I mean, so are there effective? So we'll have a look at this question that we were going to ask, which, but are there some effective methods? Why do we use them? What are we trying to get out of assessment? We know that at the end of it, I think the end point is we're trying to grade and sort, aren't we? Which I'm not convinced is the best thing we can do for children. Grading and sorting and ranking is, you know, I have my own perceptions on that, but I recognise that that's what the certification system is for. It's to say that you have acquired this amount of knowledge at this level, which means that you can go over here or go over there, and we know that you've got these capabilities. But assessment's surely more than that, isn't it? Isn't it about helping the learner improve? From my point of view, assessment is more useful as a formative tool than it is a summative badging of a student's capacity.
Did you see there was a recent research over the weekend that said I think it was 1/5 of children just don't feel like they improve at all, and there was an increasing amount that said that, you know, it wasn't making a difference. So yeah, they get their grade and that's it.
Yeah, but it's got to do then with the feedback, isn't it? I mean, I was reading a paper over the weekend as well about it's to do with essay writing really, but it's about written corrective feedback, and the researchers had had a cohort of students that they were working with, and they divided them into 4 different groups and had given them different types of feedback, and then they looked at which types of feedback led to the biggest improvement in the next revision of that same essay. So I think the grade just doesn't help, and I think, like, if you want students to improve, then you have to have the assessments connected to each other.
Yes, they need to be iterative. They need to build.
They need to build upon each other, because, like, if I look at my kids with their math test, for example, each math test, is just, it's this topic, we've covered this topic, that's a test about that. That means we've covered the topic, that topic is done, tick it off the box in the curriculum, go on to the next topic. So even though, say, a child did very poorly in that particular test, and the child then sees, oh yeah, okay, I've got problems with long division, for example, it's not going to come up in the next test. And as a parent, you can say, hey, exactly, as a parent, you can say, hey, you really need to look at that again. But the child will say to you, based on their just-in-time learning, yeah, but it's not going to come up in the next test.
So I suppose if we go back to that idea of skills, and that's one thing we want them to get better at, and then we're saying we want them to improve. Okay, this is the key bit, time for a change. We're in this moment right now where AI, from our personal opinion, can have a real influence on that. So how do we use AI to leverage the improvement in skills and the improvement in students' own progress?
There's been a lot of discussion in higher ed and in the English language, the English as a foreign language, English as a second language, scene about, the problem. Well, as they see, AI as a problem, right? That students are using it. So first of all, I think students that we have today are not the same as students that we had 10, 20 years ago. I remember when I had to do term papers. I don't know. I think I don't know if I was the lucky one, if I was the exception, but we could choose our courses. We could choose the topics that we wanted to do. I mean, it's similar to the IEP, I suppose, to the extended project that you mentioned. But there was just a genuine curiosity. It was, I think, a time of knowledge for knowledge's sake. But now it's more like, grade inflation, knowledge economy.
It's very transactional.
Very transactional, right? How much time should I put in for this, and what grade will I get? You do have a small percentage who want to excel and who want to do really well, but there will be, and I don't want to offend all the students out there that we have, but there's just students who, and my students have said to me, no, well, it saves so much time, right? That means what we have to do is, I suppose, show them, encourage, the ethical use of AI in their work. I mean, I have had students who've said to me, well, we can use generative AI to help us brainstorm certain topics. So I think, and also as teachers, I think in terms of assessment, especially with take-home assessment, what we're going to have to think about is how to design our assessment in such a way that it cannot be done by AI, right? So if you're going to give them a take-home essay, describe Charles Dickens' depictions of education in these 3 novels. Of course, you can put it into AI and go, put in the question and say, please include 5 references, and AI can do that for you.
Yeah.
Right.
Here's a very different approach, because the gentleman that was going to join us tonight, Mike, has a very different alternative approach in terms of, he believes that we can grade the conversations that you have with AI. And then rather than grading the output, you're grading their thought-based process and how they're interacting, and who's the better communicator with that. Will end up having a better output.
But here's the question, though. I mean, it sounds good, and they've done that in ELT. I've seen that before, where somebody used that method in teaching students writing skills. But my question is, how much time have you got as a teacher to do that? Because you've got to be pragmatic about it as well.
I actually did something very similar towards the end of my time in Dubai. I was teaching in English as a second language cohort, and we were doing emails, and students were just learning to practice their functional English. And I set up a chat bot, and they had to, they were basically email. It was a passive house. We'd been looking at passive houses, and they had to email their ideal build for the house. They had to plan this, and they had to send an email, and then it would respond and saying, I need some more details. And so I got them into this conversation, and I actually used it along those lines. But I fortunately had a reasonable amount of time to set it up. My expertise was already pretty embedded, and I was using a platform that was appropriate. And we prepped it. We said we were looking at emails because actually one of the tasks on that paper was write an email in response to this. And so we then practiced something that was backwards and forwards, and they sent an email and it responded, and then they had to respond to that, and then was the final answer good enough? And in a limited way we were doing that. But as you say, it's how many of those can you do? And
exactly. I mean, you can do it if you have a small cohort,
which I had a very small cohort.
Yeah, but if you're teaching full time, if you have, I don't know what workloads are like in England, but I know that in Germany classes are on average 30 students, between 30 and 35 students, and you have, as a teacher, you have 12 teaching hours a week. And sometimes, say, if you were a teacher of, say, English and math, then you'd have maybe 4 math classes and, I don't know, 6 English classes, and across different years. And I think that's why sometimes teachers go for the traditional paper pen. I mark it, I return it, story finished, go to the next one. It's not feasible.
No.
We've had the man of the hour has arrived.
Okay.
So we can bring Mike in.
I am going to find my mouse and add Mike to the stage. You made it. Okay.
Hi everyone. Yes.
I'm so gonna scoot though. I'm gonna scoot. Bye guys.
Thank you so much for coming on, Duke.
Fashionably late. I apologize, guys. I thought we were at 3:30. I apologize. It's the time change, but here I am. I hope I'm not too late.
That's all right. No, not at all. We've got a good at least half an hour, which we can go through some of the coaches.
Yeah.
It was actually we just had Khan Duke on, who's a unit over at university in Germany, teaching over there. So it's really interesting to get her perspective on where, how we're maybe not preparing the students. And I've spoken to some of my friends who are university lecturers. They're frustrated by how we're not preparing them effectively with some of the skills in particular. Was one of the discussions,
But anyway, Mike, would you care to just quickly introduce yourself and sort of like what your interest in assessment is in particular, and your kind of particular take on things? We kind of sort of introduced you. I don't know if you caught us introducing you slightly earlier.
Yeah, sure. No problem. Yeah, so my name is Mike Kentz. I have taught English and writing for 10 years prior to launching AI Literacy Partners about 8 months ago. Prior to that, I was a journalist, but the majority of my career has been as a teacher. And last year, as an English teacher at an independent school in Georgia, I was thinking about it in a lot of different ways. I was thinking about the assessment problem in terms of not only the AI cheating issue, which is how do I assign an essay and feel like I can, really rely on the integrity of the assessment itself, but also in terms of AI literacy, I was kind of thinking to myself, how do I build AI literacy and also sort of address this problem at the same time? And so I started experimenting. I started saying to my students, I'm going to teach you a little bit about AI. I'm going to try to put it in front of you and get you kind of interacting in a way that I think is more ethical, more effective, more thoughtful than just sort of pressing a button and expecting it to do your work for you. And what I found is I kind of found a couple of different methods to doing that in a way that kind of killed two birds with one stone. It addressed the academic or the assessment integrity question, but it also taught them some AI literacy, and it also allowed me to see their thinking and give them feedback on their metacognition and their creativity, communication, all of these great things. And so got really excited about it and decided, okay, I'm going to go full time into this because I really want to get this message out and share it with the world because I think it's transformational.
We might have to have a word from our sponsors as we're about at the halfway point. Is that right?
I think that's at the end of it.
We're going to do
we can do 45. See how we get on.
Yeah, see how we get on.
We
forgot to do it the last time, so I thought we might have
What's really interesting in building on what Khan Duke and what us were talking about, you hear the skills you just mentioning there, the communication, the metacognition. You're like, yeah, if we could bottle that and get it into our classrooms, let's go. You know, that like, why not? So I suppose the thing that really surprised me when you said is ethics, because we talk about the ethical implications of AI quite a bit, and that can be quite concerning. So could you explain to me how you found it to be more ethical from what I could understand?
Yeah, ethics, I have found the deeper I get into the philosophy of AI and the philosophy in general of the concept of ethical AI use, I realize ethics are very personal. I find that I have conversations with educators I'll just give you an example, where one writing teacher says that, you can use AI for a first draft, but you shouldn't use it for revisions, for example. But then I talk to another writing teacher who says the opposite, says never use it for a first draft, but or flip it. And I go, oh, that's interesting. Those two very seasoned, experienced writing teachers have a different opinion. And so I've kind of come around to this idea, like we all kind of have a different perspective, and it's a very subjective concept of what it would mean to be ethical. But what I kind of found is in a given context, you can model for students what you personally feel is ethical in the case of using AI for brainstorming, for revision, for, drafting or something like that. As long as you give them a little bit of comparison, as long as you give them sort of a better and worse interaction to analyze, and that ultimately allows you to deliver your message about what you want to see in terms of ethical AI use, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'd just like to pick up on the metacognition element, because that is something that I think, do you find that working with AI, students are engaging more deeply with metacognitive processes than they do with more traditional modes of assessment in particular and modes of engagement?
They can. That's what's interesting. I think it's an option when you use AI. And what I mean by that is you could just sort of type in a one sentence, give me this, press enter, or you could slow down and you can reflect in the middle of a conversation and ask yourself a series of questions. What is it that I'm trying to do? Why am I trying to do it? What tactics am I using, and why am I using those tactics? And so you can kind of slow it down and decide, I'm going to reflect on myself rather than just expect the AI to give me what I want, and actually think deeply about everything you put in. And so I've kind of found, that I didn't know I was really teaching metacognition when I was telling my students, I'm going to really focus on these interactions that you have with AI. But I found that opportunity was there. And it just so happens that being metacognitive when you use AI actually produces better outputs too. And so it's kind of like a lucky, happy accident that, because it requires more thought to use AI well, we can teach it through that lens, I guess.
Yeah, and if we look at the research, if we want to really talk about leveraging improvements in students' capabilities, metacognitive processes are some of the most powerful. They actually rank above even things like effective feedback.
Yeah, they're transferable, right? Being metacognitive is transferable into almost every context that I can think of. Whatever problem you're trying to solve, in order to sort of effectively solve it, you've got to periodically stop and ask yourself questions about your own strategy, about your own tactics. So whether it's writing an essay or setting up a podcast and having a conversation, or doing a speech and a presentation, solving math problems, doing a lab report, whatever. You've got to be able to self-reflect and be self-aware about your own strategies in order to, transfer across all these different mediums.
So I suppose my thing that I'd like to know, if I'm walking in tomorrow and I've got to teach psychology and I want to flip that classroom and I want to get all these skills in, how do I do it? That's my big one.
Yeah, that is the big question, right? Yeah, my thinking about assessment, and it's kind of a big sort of thesis, but the very first thing is that we just need to expand assessments to be much larger and provide a lot of choice to students. So I'm going to get to the metacognition in a second, but the first step is to make it much bigger. I view our traditional assessment protocols as kind of like a prefix menu when you walk into a restaurant, like a really nice restaurant. You walk in and they give you that menu and it's like, this is what you're eating. And you're like, okay, I guess this is what I have to like now.
I like that. That's a really good one.
Yeah. That's kind of what most of our assessments over the last couple of decades basically are. Do this, do it this way, and then I'll tell you whether or not you
enjoyed it.
Yeah, whether or not you enjoyed it, right? But I'm kind of thinking about assessments, and I don't know if this is a true cultural thing in the UK, but in the US, if you go to a diner in particular, you get these huge menus. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Through like the things that are about the size of your table in front of you. Yeah,
exactly. And it's like sometimes it's overwhelming, but you get like 100 options, and it's kind of a running joke. And here in the States, go to diner, get this big menu. But that's kind of the analogy I would draw, because what that requires in the first place is that students have to make a ton of choices along the way, and they have to engage in very sort of problem solving based skills just to even make it, or just to even decide what they want to do or decide what they want to eat in that analogy. But to answer your question, Mike, after that, what you're going to do is set up a lot of checkpoints along the way. And the way that I found to really teach that metacognition was to set a benchmark for AI use and say, this is what I expect to see in the interaction. And I can talk about how we set that benchmark, but ultimately, then you're going to go in and have that dialogue with AI. And I'm going to grade that interaction as like 30 or 40% of the grade. And the overall assessment is now much lower because I know AI can produce that essay that I used to assign. And the interaction, the dialogic interaction with a benchmark, the student now has to really think while they use AI, because they know Mr. Kentz is looking at everything I say in this conversation, and he's grading everything I say. So I got to be really, really thoughtful, reflective, and purposeful with everything I do.
And so presumably as well, I mean, is one knock-on effect that students end up, because they're being assisted, because they're being more thoughtful, is the final output becoming, for want of a better word, better?
Yeah. That's the really cool part, is because, the more creative they are in the chat, because they know I'm grading their creativity in the chat, the conversation becomes this like much more interesting, much more expansive thing where, if they were just asking for an essay, they'd, 2 prompts and then copy and paste and move on. But by forcing them to be creative, they start to unfold. Oh, I could do this. Oh, I could do this. Oh, I could do this. And it goes deeper and deeper, and the product becomes much more interesting as a result.
I think one of the things, and again, I'm sorry, I'm going completely off the map of questions that we had, but is one consequence of AI in this space going to be that we're going to have to start, and we should expect to move the bar for product higher?
I completely agree. I think the one sort of caveat or difference I would say is I don't think it's going to be us that sets the bar higher. That's actually, you know what I mean? I don't think
the machines themselves and the
no, I think it's the students. I think it's
because
I think in that last example I gave, again, forcing them to be really critical thinkers, forcing them to be creative, forcing them to be metacognitive, all of a sudden, and I saw this happen, their products, like you alluded to, got more interesting than I couldn't have even thought of it myself. It was the students you can make an argument that the AI came up with it, or you could say that the student with the AI or the student, it kind of, it's sort of different for every conversation. But the point is, it wasn't me, I didn't dictate it. It just happened.
Yeah. And in the end, if we were talking about a product focused kind of assessment system, if our aim is to make a product, the product is made, the students were involved in that product with a tool that exists. So, they are, as you say, that bar will be being raised by what they produce.
And ultimately, this is what they will be doing in the workplace. They really, like most people I talk to in the workplace are using it nowadays. So, teaching our students to use it the best way possible is good. One thing I was thinking about with this, people that are head teachers, SOT might be concerned. How does this then impact how well they do with traditional assessments? Because they still have to go and take a GCSE over here in A-level and the assessment tools you have over there.
SATs, presumably.
I think that is kind of the biggest tension in adapting assessment right now, because to your point, over here in the US, if you're a public school teacher, you have to worry about them the same way that you're describing. And that's how I make my livelihood. That's how the school stays open. That's how we get our funding. And there's a major, major disconnect there. I think there's been a disconnect there for a while, if we're being completely honest, right? Standardized state tests and SATs and ACTs. I get why they're built the way they're built. I mean, it's very hard to create measures that are not standard in nature, that are sort of fixed. And that becomes problematic. So the way I kind of talk to, to teachers in the situation you described is, first of all, the thing that I'm describing, don't do it like every day, every week, or every month or anything like that. This is sort of once in a while. And you can still, I think you still have to kind of go back to paper and pen for some of those sort of things that they're going to be doing in standardized tests. It's unfortunate, but I think that's the reality. And you do that paper and pen for a while, and then you create this sort of expansive project-based learning experience once a unit, maybe, to sort of prepare them for both.
So what's been the reception to this, just out of interest? What's been your experience? How have schools, and I know that you've obviously worked in the state, but also in the public and in the private sector as well, haven't you, in both kinds of schools? Is there a difference there, and how are schools in general adapting?
Yeah, I think public schools are really struggling because they have so much more red tape, so much more bureaucratic red tape to get through kind of, even think about putting AI in front of a student. So generally speaking, I've, for this particular idea, I'm really only able to work with independent schools, higher ed, and charter schools.
I mean, don't worry, because your Department of Education is being taken apart, so then you'll be able to do whatever you like.
Yeah. Sorry. That just that little elephant in the room that we forget about from time to time, just that's happening too. Yeah. But the reception is kind of uniform. People are like very interested in the idea. And one thing that I didn't realize as I kind of started talking about this about 8 months ago was that the benchmarking process, actually benchmarking what you want to see in the chat is actually maybe the most interesting part of the whole thing. Because
how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, one of the things that I realized is that, effective AI use or ethical AI use, whatever word you want to use, really can only be determined on a relative basis. And what I mean by that is, if I printed out a transcript of me talking with AI and was like, here, this is good, do this, it doesn't really tell you anything. You can look at that and go, I guess that's good. I don't technically know that it is.
Yeah.
But if I create two and I create a comparison where I create one that's better and one that's worse, and in each case, what I did is I was a fictional student on the page seeking to achieve the same goal and just going about it in a different way. This fictional student was like very thoughtful, very creative, very communicative. This student wasn't. And what we did is we just went through a close reading exercise, read both transcripts, find the differences. What do you notice? What's student A doing that student B is not doing? And as a result of that, they could, again, that comparison is what, the comparison bred understanding of what it might mean to have a good chat versus a worse chat. And the beauty of it is that once they started to see that, we actually co-constructed the rubric together.
Oh, right. Okay, nice.
Yeah, because I asked them, I said, well, what do you notice? What's student A doing? What's student B doing? And they gave me some things. Some of them were what I had planned and some were not. Some were things they noticed that I didn't even notice. And so
that's excellent pedagogy anyway, isn't it? Co-constructing rubrics and comparative readings.
Yeah. And so, it's very similar, it's writing instruction really. And it's just you just replace the essay with the transcript. And instead of analyzing two exemplar, non-exemplar essays, we're just analyzing an exemplar, non-exemplar transcript.
And is there some way in which this is also, I mean, we've got writing, but this is also taking it one stage further, because I think we've had this discussion before. So just for context, Mike and I have connected a while back. We were in very different time zones because I was in the Middle East, and times were even trickier then. I don't know how we managed that, but what you're teaching there as well, it's beyond right. It's also those communication skills, isn't it? Because we want them to talk to the AI in a very human way.
Exactly. Yeah. Ultimately, there again, that student A, student B. Student A is, you could argue, over communicating, or whatever word you want to use. They're contextualizing everything that they're trying to achieve, or whatever problem they're trying to solve, and that, to your point, is communication. It's dialogic communication. And that co-constructing of a rubric, the other point I would make is it turned me looking at their transcripts into less of like a gotcha moment. I'm not a policeman who's like just going to tell you what the right or wrong thing is. We're going to decide together what it would mean to use AI well in this context. And that's your benchmark. We made it together. Go ahead and see if you can mimic it. And the beauty of that last part is no two chats are the same. So students can't copy you. They can't, sometimes if you're a writing teacher, you guys may have had this experience. You give them an exemplar essay, and I've had students who basically copy every sentence, you know what I mean? And they just replace some of the stuff. And it's like, that's not what you want. So the beauty of this is they can't, because every chat is different.
I think the worst of it is sometimes we're often so hooked on using writing frames that what we do is we give kids the essays pretty well made and get them to swap out some of the vocabulary, and surprise, surprise, you get 30 of the same description coming back. We've zoomed in on a small detail now, have we? But yeah, as you said, with an AI, two people can ask the same question and it'll give you different answers and it'll go down different things. So in many respects, I think, and that's an interesting question. That's an interesting sort of point to consider, because I think that actually almost improves assessment by de-standardizing it, because it forces it to be more on, the students have to adapt. They can't just all do the same thing, can they? They can't just rote learn a response.
No, and that's where the metacognitive skills come in, isn't it? That communication skills. So I want to try this, Mike. This is my big thing. Like, I'm going to try as best I can. We're going to have two problems. One will be trying to get around the red tape. In Britain, unless it's guardrailed, we're not allowed to give a royal LLM. So I might be able to give them a guardrailed chatbot of some variety. Am I still going to be able to do that?
Yeah, definitely. One thing that's really interesting is, depending on the bot you choose, it definitely changes the rubric. So, it's something I try to emphasize, because I have a rubric up on my website for people to use if they want to get started. But I make the point, it's really a boilerplate, and you've got to decide for that particular bot how the goal of the chat changes. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have like a debate bot, for example. The student conversation with a debate bot is going to be very different than a brainstorming chat, if that makes sense, right? A brainstorming chat is very expansive. We're just trying to problem solve. A debate bot is going to be on a specific subject or content piece. And so what I'm evaluating in the chat when they talk to a debate bot is more, content knowledge, argumentation, rhetoric abilities. And, the way that I haven't done this in the class, but the way that I might do it is say, I'm the debate judge, and I'm going to decide whether or not you beat the AI bot or whether the AI bot beat you. Right.
You'd actually have it a conversation, one versus the other. You could do that in pairs, couldn't you? I mean, I'm straight away thinking I always do a debate is psychology of science, which from my perspective, of course it is. But, my point of view is And yeah, bringing that in and them trying to argue against it could be really effective.
Yeah. And students tend to kind of actually find that activity fun or interesting because they like a challenge, they like a battle, they like a game. The thing that you end up having to tell them, the difference with a human to human debate is that like the other human will stop when they lose. But AI doesn't, right? So you have to tell them, you have to be like, listen, even if you feel like you've won, end the chat and send me the transcript. You know what I mean?
It is not going to stop at any point.
Right. It's never going to be like, I yield, you know?
Yeah. It's that Terminator moment, it'll just keep coming.
Right. But yeah, that's an example, a different bot changes the interaction. Just one other really quick example. If you're doing a character bot, which is something that I did do, so like a Napoleon bot or I did Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, the objective of the chat also changes because now the bot is not brainstorming a problem with you. They're exhibiting a personality, And so in the case of Holden, I said to my students, I want to see you showing empathy and active listening because he's a depressed, his personality is depressed. So again, the objective changes by the bot and by the task.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I do love the character bot. I remember doing a Macbeth character bot to get the kids to explore motivation. I was saying what I want you to do is try and dive into, what is the motivation behind this, and look at the interaction with the other characters. Try and delve into what are the reasons behind the character's motivation. As you say, that would be rated very differently to that. I was talking before about some ELT students I was doing, some English language training I was doing with some students who were then just doing an interaction to get a response, responding to an email and sending it backwards and forwards. As you say, the character of that assessment will change dramatically depending on the bot and its use.
Exactly. Yeah.
We're doing artificial intelligence ironically at the minute in religious education and doing the Turing test. And I think that would be a great use actually, where the students have got to try and work out via that questioning technique is, get that moment where they've tricked it and they know it's a bot, as opposed to a human, because it is incredibly realistic nowadays when you're having conversations with them.
I love that also, for a lot of different reasons, but one of them is what you just described is very hard to do. And like, that's one of the things I try to emphasize with the assessment discussion is we need to find things that are hard to do for students.
It is. It is incredibly hard because ironically, I cheated. I used AI to help me. so I did cheat a little bit to try and work out, and then it did manage to. It is really hard to do.
Yeah, but that helps you kind of set the benchmark, right? Because then you're like, okay, here's how it actually worked. I know what works and what doesn't. Yeah. But yeah, that pushes students a lot, right? And that's what we have to do is find these things that are hard to do. And
in the lesson, the number of questions and the engagement, and then straight away the thinking, they're all switched on. Which is what you want.
Have you? So we're just looking at this. Some of the questions that we were talking about, I think a lot of educators will probably still find this is very bleeding edge kind of approaches to in systems that, let's face it, are still very, very wedded to those traditional methods. Are there any kind of, are you encountering any sort of downsides or resistance, or are you seeing anything where we said before, we do have to obviously make sure we go back to that pen and paper assessment, prepare kids for SATs. Are you kind of seeing are there any downsides to these digital methodologies and these, using chatbots that you've witnessed or identified?
Definitely. Yeah. I think, there's a real risk I'll put it this way. There's some risk of bringing AI into the classroom because we don't really know what it's doing to our brains yet. And so I have some concern that AI ultimately we're going to find out is quite addictive, in a different way than perhaps social media is addictive because social media is entertainment. But AI, I think, is possibly maybe going to fit into that place, I guess. And so there's this question of like, do I bring something in that technically might hurt them long term? I ultimately land on, and there's a study that was published on this recently, the more AI literacy that a student has, the less likely they are to use it as a shortcut.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, something that I felt was true at the beginning, and it's turned out, you know, the early studies are indicating that it is true. So that's the good side of things. You know, it's like you are actually, the more knowledge they have, the less likely they are to get addicted. However, you know, I think there's real risks to your point. And, you know, if you've got, let's say you've got other teachers in your building who are like not ready for this, and you're that teacher who's doing this sort of bleeding edge thing, you know, that's going to create some tension probably. You know, I know it did for me last year. But, you know, someone's got to experiment. That's kind of the way I framed it to them. I was like, listen, someone's going to have to figure this out, right? So why not try and see what works? That's sort of a convoluted answer. I think there's a lot there, though.
I'm just going to briefly introduce and pause for 2 seconds and go back to our publishers. Sponsors of the show. So we've got 2 fantastic sponsors, John Catt Education, who are a fantastic educational and professional development over here. You might not have heard of Mike, but they're UK, mainly UK based, but they do it around the world. You can level up your professional development, and we have 20% off using that code if you do. And then actually this one really links into what we were talking about today. Kialo Education is a BET award-winning system me and John have mentioned. I don't know if you've heard of it, Mike. 100% free, really gets your students thinking and engaging with discussions, minded subject knowledge and critical thinking skills. So definitely one to go and have a look at.
And on that note, I would say Kialo I've found really powerful. It's not AI powered, doesn't have that sitting in there, but it is it's a method. Because one of the advantages I found with AI, and I'm going to ask you for your experience of this, is that sometimes it gives students a voice who wouldn't otherwise find a voice. They're more comfortable with a typed communication. They can be more, you actually get more from that student than you would have done in, say, a classroom debate interaction. Kialo is a really powerful platform for doing that, because it's like Mentimeter, like a few others, but this one's really specifically designed for debating and works really well, and with a built-in rubric where students have to put in a certain amount. But have you found that as well, that sometimes AI is giving voice to the voiceless? Yeah, you can really, you know, not just from the interactions, but sometimes in the interactions, you see students come out of their shell sometimes, because it's a little bit lower stakes and they feel a little bit safer. Again, there's some risks there too, but if you think about it as a scaffold, you know, a scaffold for voice, a scaffold for personality, a scaffold for coming out of your shell, scaffold for finding out who you are. I think we can really consider that as a possible reality, that those students would benefit from this. And I've definitely seen it. Yeah, absolutely.
I like the fact that, you know, it's a slow introduction. Like, you know, we still have the traditional assessment method that we need to think about. And so doing this on project-based once a half term in that subject area, something like that, is a really good way to introduce. I'm going to go back to actually something that Kandix mentioned about how have you found it in terms of increasing your the workload on yourself, and how have you ensured that, because obviously you're grading a lot of conversation, that could be phenomenal amounts times 30 students.
I'm glad you brought that up. I learned from experience on this one. I didn't think about that. I think it was the second time I did it. And I had, like, per class, I had like 150, 200 plus pages of transcripts to go through. Now I will tell you, as a quick plug, I had more fun grading the transcripts than I've had grading anything else in 10 years of teaching. It was so interesting. That said, what I did, Mike, the next time is I said to them, okay, same drill, but I'm only going to grade your first 7 prompts. And so you can keep using it afterwards. But when you send me the whole transcript, fine. But I'm only going to grade your first 7. And I was doing that for myself. But the benefit, this was really cool. The benefit was that some of my students, without me telling them to, opened up a Google Doc separate from the AI chat, drafted every single prompt. They drafted, revised, refined, sometimes turned it over to a friend and said, what do you think about this, before they put it in. So they were slowing down naturally and organically, because, again, they knew, okay, every single thing.
That's a really, really simple, effective way, isn't it? It's like you've got I've had students in the past where they like to ask a lot of questions, and sometimes have said, you've got a maximum of 3 questions. Do you want to use this? So it's actually the same kind of problem. Have you ever used AI to actually mark the questions that they're asking?
A great question. I tried. It can't do it. At this point, it cannot data. I've tried to create bots that create those benchmark transcripts that I described earlier, and it can't do it. And I think the reason why it can't do it is the data doesn't exist yet.
Okay.
Right. If you think about it, all AI is really doing is just obviously taking all the data that we've ever created and categorized and decide this is good, this is bad, and then of course predicting patterns based on that data. The data on this doesn't exist yet, which to me is like very exciting, because that means we get to build the data, right? We get to build this massive library of benchmark
interactions.
And then eventually, I mean, I see it, my vision or my expectations will take years, at least decades, maybe. But eventually you've got this incredible library data set that you could feed back in, and then it would be able to do it. But right now it can't, which is a good thing, because it means teachers still have quite a bit,
got a few years of job left in us. Bit of employment still there.
It's nice to know we've got some intelligence above it as well. We can still got some skills.
I mean, it's a really interesting point. I want to reiterate that for our listeners and anybody out there who catches up with this on a podcast. But that is really fascinating what you said, because the AI feels like it's very good at conversation, but it's been trained on flat prose. It's been trained on static material that existed. And let's face it, if it was trained on the internet and the kind of standard of debate you see on the internet, it's hardly going to be great at grading effective communication. Maybe yelling into the void, perhaps it'll have a pretty decent handle on. But once we start to see a great deal of that really powerful interaction, and we can do that, and particularly as we get models that we know that now you can run a model locally on a laptop, and in 2 to 3 years' time, we'll all have GPT-4 level built into our desktop devices, and you can train your own model based on those quality interactions. And I can really see how that would build. But it's, as you say, it's not there yet, is it?
No, yeah. And I mean, a kind of a cool piece of it that I kind of love to remember is, its intelligence, if we could call it that, is entirely data-based, right? It's teaching itself, quote unquote, but our ability to think is not entirely data-based. I can move into a new space where I don't know anything and still sort of function. I'm thinking about like being in a setting that you've never been. Go to a foreign country, right? You go to a country where you don't speak the language. Humans have the ability to sort of adapt. We have the ability to kind of think through a situation, even if we don't have the data already in our head. Whereas AI is in this situation where it can really only do things if the data exists in its training set. Which
for all the cries of AGI is on its way, they've not managed to generalize anything yet, have they? Really?
No, doesn't seem so.
What I would just going to track back. How useful have you found the new developments in terms of the thinking models? Because I was working with Gemini a couple of days ago, and I recently posted about it, showing its thinking. It showed its decision-making process. Is that going to provide some useful models for students, do you think?
That's a really interesting point. When I use those reasoning models, it's interesting to see what it says it's thinking, definitely.
Whether or not it is thinking.
Right. Yeah. I can't necessarily, I haven't had the experience yet where I felt like, okay, 01 is just doing something so much better than 4.0. I haven't had that experience personally, but it's certainly interesting. And so I wonder if you could create an exercise out of that, like take that internal monologue that AI is producing and analyze that in some way.
I've used it. I've worked with some AI programs for marking and assessment. And when I've been able to see the thinking, it's helped me to change the feedback rubric and the instructions to then leverage better feedback. So it's definitely helped me. So you'd imagine there might be a way for those students to do that.
Yeah, and what you just described was like the most meta thing I've ever heard. There were like 4 layers in there, right? Like the feedback rubric is getting feedback from a system that's also providing feedback on itself, and then there's like 6 layers going on there, which is fascinating.
It's the thing we've always said is that students we worry that they're using it to be less effective and just do things quicker. But we've always found it's the opposite. Since AI and we've been using it, we're thinking more. We might be putting things out quicker sometimes. We might be able to get things done faster, but our thinking is definitively better.
I agree. Yeah, I'm finding the same thing. I was guilty of pressing the button, quote unquote, in the early days and over time, and I still do from time to time, Yeah, over time, I've found that I am using it as a mirror much more, using it to reflect on my own processes and my own thinking and my own, how I go through solving dilemmas. And to your point about thinking more, I often try to quote Norbert Wiener. Do you know that name? He was an AI researcher in the 60s who was kind of an AI doomer, quote unquote. And he has this quote where he says, "We are going to have to think 10 times harder than we ever have before to ensure that we maintain control over our world and don't give it over to AI." And so that's something that could happen naturally or organically, or it's something that we could force ourselves to do. Of course, he's taking that negative lens, but there's also the positive lens. There's both.
Forces you to be better. Well, as we were saying, it raises the bar for students. So we're just sort of moving towards the back end of this discussion and thinking about practically, how can we encourage schools to move to a more effective system? Is there anything we can do, or is it beyond our abilities? I mean, do we have to wait until the external pressure from AI becomes so much it cracks our assessment system? What do we do?
I think it's kind of always a case of it flowing downhill. So if you think about it as a high school educator, high school English teacher, I'm thinking about that state test, or I'm thinking about that SAT, right? Okay, so what are the SATs thinking about? They're thinking about higher education, right? So that it flows downhill from higher ed to whoever's giving the SAT, ACT, whatever. Well, what's higher ed thinking about? They're thinking about business, right? And so I think it has to flow all the way from business down to the standardized testing systems. And one thing I'm really excited about is, the workplace is actually, I don't think they've realized it yet, but they're actually going to face the same problem that we as educators face in terms of seeing student thinking. I'll give you an example. If I run a mid-sized business and I'm trying to hire for a position, and I've got 2 candidates, candidate A and candidate B, and they're entry level, right? They're just out of college. I want someone who knows how to use AI, right? And I also want someone who knows content and all that. And I give them some kind of a performance task to show me that they know what they're doing in that particular field. Or I do a remote interview or something like that, and they produce something and hand it to me. How do I actually know that this candidate knows what they're doing, right? Or if let's say I'm emphasizing AI skills, I have the same problem. Just because you produce this with AI doesn't mean that you're actually a quote unquote good AI user. And so I think the problem in hiring it already is, but I think they're going to realize soon it's the exact same problem that educators are facing in assessment. And so my hope, I mean, maybe it's a little bit far-fetched, but my optimistic view is that hiring methods change, training methods change, and businesses start to also emphasize metacognition. They also emphasize problem solving and communication and critical thinking. And they also assess it the way that we're talking about assessing it right now. And then it flows downhill. Higher education realizes we need to prepare them for this, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, we already see a bit of a disconnect in the UK between what business is saying. Students, I mean, they're saying they lack soft skills, they lack creativity, they're not great with many things like timekeeping, project work, all of the things that we know AI and what you're talking about feeds into. So yeah, hopefully that critical mass, that dam will break and it'll flow down, and it'll get here eventually.
I think there's a real opportunity there to create stronger links with businesses and schools, and then that hopefully slightly more enmeshment will see the connection between what they want which will be AI skills at some point if it's not there all the place. And then schools can see that, and that connection can hopefully come across with those problem solving and all those bits and pieces. And then guess what? We're pushed into hopefully doing these things a little bit more.
Yeah. I agree. I think that bridge, especially between higher ed and business, it's right there waiting to be built.
Yeah. And we're already seeing that, the OECD and the World Economic Forum have both predicted massive disruption from artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to need to be, actually it turns out most of the predictions are suggesting that there'll be more jobs created than there will be lost, but that means that a lot of people will need to move. New jobs, 100 million new jobs across various economies will be created, but 90 million will be lost. So there's 190 million shifting jobs, so people need to be prepared.
And the skills are going to change there, aren't they? I got one last one for you, Mike, personally. 5 years time, classic thing. If we can predict the future, but
I'll be retired.
What do you really hope to see in the assessment process, maybe in class and on a broader scale?
Yeah, 5 years from now, what I hope is at the high school level that, honestly, I hope that evaluating student interactions with AI is not, the only thing we do, but I hope that it's viewed as relatively normal. And I hope that it's not viewed as, oh, I'm an AI teacher now. I hope that it's viewed as I'm a thinking teacher. And it just so happens I'm using the interaction with AI to develop those skills. And I think if we can, that's one of the roadblocks that I run into is people go, I signed up to be a math teacher. I signed up to be a science teacher, not an AI teacher. And if you can just get people to see that this is actually what we've always wanted to teach, then you get into a situation where people accept it as a relatively normal thing to do.
How do you get, because this is one of the things that I've been talking about, and I've had a couple of conversations recently. People are very precious over the fact that I am the teacher of this subject. I own this knowledge and it is mine, and I must teach this knowledge and get off. It's how do you get past that to you need to guide students to the knowledge they want?
That's a great question. That's very much an emotional thing that you just described, right? It's sort of an emotional, psychological roadblock. And, what I saw in myself and in my colleagues was a lot of grief in the early days, grieving process going on. In the first 8 months after ChatGPT was released, I wouldn't read a single article about it because I was so upset. I was so annoyed. And then, eventually I kind of came around to it. And so to answer your question, John, I feel like, honestly, teachers need to have space to really, frankly, vent a little bit and get past that and recognize, okay, I was an English teacher. I was a history teacher. Now I'm just a teacher. In these certain situations, I still need to teach them good sentence structure. I still need to teach them the structure of an essay. Absolutely. But there's going to be a piece of your job that is generalist in nature. There's going to be a moment if you're really preparing a student for a world where AI is kind of everywhere, some of it has to be generalist in nature. But I definitely don't have a skeleton key or a cure for that, but I think it's emotional in nature,
Yeah, we definitely do see that. You see some people that are just not involved in it at all. It doesn't exist, does it? And then, some people are very anti. We've seen that in some of their own reflections.
People take it very personally.
Yeah, they do.
I took it personally. I'll be the first to admit it. I felt like that I was being attacked on a personal level. Like I was like, I can't believe this. I became a teacher thinking that it was a very secure industry to be in, and now they're talking about replacing teachers for good, and it's like I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. I guess obviously I kept because I've been in the job for such a long time, and I was like, "Oh, they're going to replace teachers? Oh, good." But in all honesty, because I'd been a teacher and multidisciplinary as well, and in different contexts, I guess I was probably just more relaxed with going like, "Well, it's just another thing to teach." I've been shoved into all kinds of classrooms teaching all kinds of stuff, so why not? Yeah, let's give this a go too.
I feel like we're coming towards the end of our discussion. I'll just finish off with just one more little shout out to our fantastic sponsors, John Catt, who again produce fantastic CPD resources You can go visit their website and get a 20% off discount as well using the code, just as you can see there. And then we've got Kialo is the BET Award winning system we've spoken about to really develop those critical thinking skills we've mentioned today. Exactly. It's definitely one of those things that we've tried out ourselves. Well, 1 million educators, it's a lot of students to reach. It's not bad.
Yeah.
So,
and can I just also say, Kialo is supported by a non-profit, and I think that, and it was designed specifically to try and break down barriers and introduce good debating skills. So it's coming from a really good place, I think.
I don't know if it's just an opportunity for you to just mention yourself, Mike, a little bit, and what you do, in terms of your website and things.
Yeah, sure. So I founded an organization called AI Literacy Partners, and you can find the website at litpartners.ai. And what you'll find on there are a lot of resources. We're going to be offering PD, summer PD, asynchronous, over Zoom, where we get people together to try what I've talked about today, setting benchmarks for AI use, possibly grading the chats. And right now I'm doing a lot of professional development workshops, keynotes for universities, independent schools here in the States, and consulting also on policy setting. So if you're a school that's struggling, for example, with acceptable use policy setting, that's something that I'm working on a lot. So you can find more at the website, and I got a blog on Substack, AI Edu Pathways, and I'm also on LinkedIn all the time.
Yeah. Awesome. Mike, thank you so much for joining us all the way from America. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Hope to catch you soon, mate.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you both.
Awesome.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.